This past week, I just read through the Gospel of Mark, and that's maybe a strange read just before Christmas because Mark makes no mention of the birth of Jesus in his Gospel. He jumps straight from John the Baptist to the baptism of Jesus and his temptation in the wilderness. Then, if you want to look at the other Gospels, John begins by talking about the Word. He clarifies that the Word is the pre-existent Christ when he writes in verse 14, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us." But neither does he mention the actual birth of Jesus. Luke personalizes the story of the birth of Jesus by relating that both Mary and Elizabeth probably Mary's aunt, were pregnant at the same time, and that Mary visited Elizabeth. It's a story that's most often read and talked about at Christmas, and it includes the Song of Mary, the shepherds and the angels, no room at the inn, and Jesus' presentation at the temple. So, of course, it gets most often mentioned at Christmas. Matthew gets mentioned too, because in that story, Matthew's story of the birth of Jesus, we hear about Joseph's reluctance to marry Mary because she was pregnant and he knew he hadn't done it. And then we hear about the visit of the Magi. But, by that time, it's not really a Christmas story because Jesus was already a toddler by the time the Magi came to visit. Nevertheless, it's Matthew's gospel that I want to focus on this morning. When I was first starting my preparation, I assumed that there would still be one more message after me before Christmas. So mine would be sort of like a pre-Christmas message. And I think it's appropriate that I still go ahead with that. It's what I've got. So sorry about that. This is not a Christmas story message. This is a pre-Christmas message. How many of you have ever made a New Year's resolution to read through the Bible and then got stuck at Genesis 5, trying to pronounce the names of Noah's ancestors? And they're men only, going all the way back to Adam. Or maybe you made it past Genesis 5 and even two more genealogies in Genesis 10 and Genesis 11, but finally got stuck when you came to the fourth one in Genesis 36, where there's a long list of Esau's descendants. I mean, who's Esau? And who cares? Because we have nothing to do with Esau's story again. And so finally we just give up and we never make it through. How many of you have started in Genesis and never made it to the end of the book? Okay? That may have happened to you. If that describes you, then maybe you're going to have trouble with the New Testament too. Because you start in Genesis and that's not working. You finally say, well, let me skip to Matthew. I'll start with Matthew. And you get into Matthew and you find out, well, it starts with a genealogy as well. In fact, the first words of the New Testament are, "This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah." Wow. The Gospel of Matthew begins the story of Jesus by tracing his royal roots. Now, this is not something that we would think adds an awful lot to the Christmas narrative, and some think that it makes Matthew the least inviting of the four Gospels to read. But Matthew had his own reasons for doing this, and it helps if we understand why. Matthew's Gospel was written with the Jewish audience in mind, and the Jews could be moved by the evidence of a valid royal lineage. By the time Matthew wrote his gospel, this was probably around 60 to 65 AD. So by the time Matthew wrote his gospel, most of the Jews had already rejected Jesus as Messiah. Jesus of Nazareth had not lived up to their expectations, because what they really longed for was a Messiah who would be like a conqueror, who would free them from the Romans. And obviously Jesus hadn't done that. So he was a real disappointment. In fact, you begin to understand this emerging disappointment between the triumphal entry 1 week before the crucifixion, where everybody was swinging palm branches and shouting, really excited that the Messiah was coming into Jerusalem. A week later, he hadn't done anything. And when he was captured by the chief priests, they'd had enough of him. Crucify him in 1 week. And their attitude towards Jesus never changed. Matthew's gospel sets out to demonstrate that Jesus really was the Messiah. And he begins by turning to the first century equivalent of ancestry.co.uk. The prophets had declared that the Messiah would be a son of David. So Matthew first must prove that Jesus was in the royal line of David. But he does something strange. I mean, he could have easily just started with David and continued forward up to Jesus. But instead of starting with David, who nobody doubted, nobody denied that David, even that the Messiah had to be the descendant of David. So why did he go back and start with Abraham? Well, first let me say that he divides his genealogy into 3 sections of 14 generations each. Okay? From Abraham to David, and then on from Solomon to Jeconiah, who was the last of the kings. I'll explain a little bit about that later. And then from Jeconiah on all the way to Joseph, the legal father of Jesus. So that's the way the genealogies are lined up. And I think that Matthew did this probably in order to have it be a good memory device. In those days, most people weren't reading and writing. And if you had some way that you could mentally divide it up, it made it a lot easier. And it wasn't always exactly 14 generations. I think it was between Abraham and David. But actually, between David or Solomon and Jeconiah, the last of the kings, there are actually 3 or 4 kings that weren't even mentioned in this list. But that's not significant in the way that the Jews thought, because everybody knew who the kings were. Right? I mean, they could just open their Old Testament, their Torah, and read about the kings. And so the fact that some were missing, the important bit was the 14. Don't make too much of 14. But one of the things that people have tried to explain, the Jews like something called numerology. And the letters of the name of David, D, the consonants, because they only used consonants in their writing back then, were D, W, and D. And if you line up, or if you add up the numerical value of that, it's 14. So it's just a good memory device for them to say, okay, David's name signifies 14. And if you take 3 groups of 14, you'll get from this to here, from here to there, and from there finally to the Messiah. And so that's the way that Matthew is trying to think. He's trying to make this long genealogy a little bit more interesting. Now, are your eyes glazing over already because genealogy is just not your thing? There's actually 41 and not 42 names in the genealogy that's written. So I don't know if Matthew can't quite count quite well, or if he's including one of them in both groups, or how he does it. But if you want to try and look it up, you can. But if we were to read them, your eyes really would glaze over, because even with my bit of background in these things, I would probably struggle to pronounce at least half of the names that are in there. And so many of the names are names that, apart from reading this, we've just never heard of. And so that's not not very helpful for us at all, and we won't actually do it. But you've got your Bibles, you look in Matthew 1, and it's a long list of names, a lot of which you've never heard of before. So fine enough, we've got that. Matthew does something that, their eyes might have been glazing over as well, or at least somebody that Matthew's trying to convince. You see, Matthew had a problem. I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a bit. But Matthew's background was such that it didn't exactly lend credibility to what he was, to him simply as a testimony of Jesus. And Jesus had his own problems because of his mother Mary and her getting pregnant before she was married and all of this sort of thing. So Matthew had an uphill struggle trying to get people to listen. Remember, he was writing to the Jews, and the Jews had already largely discounted Jesus as Messiah. How is he going to convince them otherwise? So he starts in with this genealogy, and he says, at least you've got to understand where Jesus comes from, because he can't be automatically excluded, because if you look at his genealogy, he actually is in the right line of people who could be the Messiah. That's what Matthew is trying to say first. But then, like I said before, why start at Abraham instead of David? Well, there's a good reason for it. Because as he writes this section, he adds the names of several women. It was very unusual for Jews of that time to put the names of women in a genealogy. The genealogy counted from father to son to grandson and so on. And so why would you even name the women? But he does. But there's a problem. He doesn't just name the wives of every one of these people in the list. He only lists about 4 of them. And when you discover who those 4 are, you find out that the first woman mentioned is Tamar. She was the daughter-in-law of Judah. Now remember, King David was the Lion of Judah. Judah was the start of his lineage and the first king. And so the Messiah also would be a Lion of Judah, right? And so he starts by mentioning this woman, Tamar, who's the daughter-in-law of Judah. He was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, and he had been married. He had 3 sons, and the first of his sons was the one that was married to this lady. I'll say Tamar because that's what I'm used to saying, but I think it's Tamar. Anyways, Tamar no sooner gets married than her husband is killed by God. It's a punishment on him because of his wickedness. We don't know what his wickedness is, but he dies before she can even get pregnant. So the custom of that day is, if you're left a widow, I know it seems strange to us, but if you're left a widow, the next brother in line in the family to your husband has to get you pregnant. And then your child will actually be considered your own husband's child, not his child. Okay? So he will have no rights to that child. And when it comes to inheritance, he gives up a share of his inheritance because it's going to the descendant of his younger brother who had died. Right? So this wasn't something that this second son was willing to do. Because if he had got pregnant, or if he had got Tamar pregnant, then the line of Judah would have passed through that one, because he would have been the oldest son of the oldest son, because it wouldn't be his, it would belong to his brother. So he wasn't willing to do it. And the Bible tells us that he still slept with her, but found ways to try and make her not get pregnant. Okay? And that was wrong. You know, trying to have it both ways. And he died as well. Now, Judah, maybe he was still a little bit superstitious, because what Judah did was tell her, look, my third son, he's too young for you. Wait till he's grown up. And his idea was that he could keep her, you know, at a distance, and maybe this would all blow over and be forgotten about, and he could get away with it completely. But a certain amount of time goes on. Tamar knows that really the time is right for her to have been given to the third son to marry. Or it's not exactly marry, but because the child should be the first sons, but and the seconds now, right? So anyways, what happens is that Tamar dresses up like a prostitute and goes out to a place where she hears that Judah is going to be passing by. Now, Judah's been, you know, these men have been dealing with sheep or whatever for some time, and so they haven't been around their wives or anything. And Judah's come back. Remember, he's been a long time out in the bush, and he's coming back, and here's this woman sitting at this sort of junction, and she's sort of, hi. And Judah ends up taking her and sleeping with her. And then he says, I have nothing to pay you with after the deed's done, right? And he says, I'll send you a sheep later in payment. And she says, well, what's the proof that I'm going to have? And he says, she says, I guess, give me your signet ring and what was the other thing? Two bits of basically ID, right? I've got your ID. I've got a credit card of yours. I got your driver's license, that sort of thing, right? And so he goes away and she just disappears. And he sends the sheep to try and get his stuff back, and there's nobody there. Some months later, all of a sudden, Judah gets word, hey, your daughter-in-law is pregnant. Now he's incensed about this because she's not married. She belongs to him in a way still. And now she's got pregnant. This is a real problem. And he was going to have her stoned to death. And then when she's brought out, she brings out the ID and says, well, actually, I got pregnant by the person who owns these things. Okay? Busted. Judah was busted. That's the first man in the line of Jesus. He's the first man also in the line of King David. So what Matthew's doing, remember, he's got problems himself, which I'll mention later. What Matthew's doing is that, yeah, but we know that the Messiah has to come from David, from the line of Judah. Well, look what Judah was like. If you think I've got problems, look at Judah. Okay, so he's mentioned the one. Now he goes on to the other. Goes on to Rahab. Now this was when the Jews were about to enter into the promised land. And Joshua sends 2 spies ahead to spy out Jericho because they were going to try and attack Jericho first. So these 2 spies go into Jericho. Where do they go? It's maybe not as big a problem as you think, because they probably went to an inn. But basically an inn in those days was a place that also provided women. And so the Bible says that this Rahab was a prostitute. She was probably also the innkeeper. Okay? She owned the business. And when they came to try and arrest these 2 spies, because somebody had got word that there's some strangers in the city, she tells the people she hid the guys, and she tells the people who had come, yeah, they were here, but they left out just before the gates were shut. So they go, and she says, if you hurry, you might catch them. So before she sends these guys safely on their way, she says, look, everybody's terrified of you people. We know that you're going to win. Please save me and my family. And they said, look, as long as you're in this place and you hang a red cord out of the window so that we can see it, we'll make sure that everybody in the house is protected. And that's what happened. Well, and so she joined the Israelites. She became an Israelite and eventually was married to somebody named Salmon. And this Salmon was one of the descendants of Judah. So one of King David's ancestors was also a prostitute. Wow. The third one. This is one that we usually think a whole lot better of. Her name is Ruth. And we know Ruth is the widowed daughter-in-law who, out of love, follows her late husband's mother, Naomi, back to Israel. And so Ruth is just one of these very special people. I'm sure you were named with every good intention, weren't you? About who Ruth was. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. And so Ruth comes along, but the problem was Ruth was a Moabite. And the law, which remember, it hadn't been that long since they had received the law, said that any Moabites, they were more despised than the Canaanites. And any Moabite, a descendant of a Moabite, was not allowed to enter the temple for 10 generations. So it's like your blood has to be so thinned out of that Moabite before you'd ever be allowed to be a proper Jew and enter the temple. Well, Ruth ends up being married. Yeah, I did put it in there. For a moment, I thought I'd missed his name. And I was trying to think, Boaz. She was married to Boaz. But you know who Boaz was? The son of Rahab the prostitute. Okay, so here's this woman from a despised foreign country. She comes in and she marries a guy who's the son of a prostitute. And that person happens to be, this Ruth, is the great-grandmother of King David. So some more scandal in the royal line. So then the fourth one, Matthew doesn't even need to name her. He just says, the one who'd been Uriah's wife. We all know who that is? Bathsheba. David committed adultery with her. And she seemed to be somehow cooperative in all of this. And then David has her husband killed because she gets pregnant and the timing is just wrong, right? And so David has Uriah killed, and then he takes her and makes her his wife. So there we have the stories. By just mentioning the names, he doesn't have to say anything. He mentions the names, and you see that in the royal line of David is scandal after scandal after scandal. And yet that's the one that God chose. Okay? So that's why he begins with Abraham instead of starting with David. Because if you started with David, you could say, well, David had a little bit of a bad start. But actually, you know, the Bible calls him a man after God's own heart. So really, you know, somehow David turned things around a bit and it continued to go fine. And one day the Messiah will come out of that line. But now that you're thinking about what happened between Abraham and David, you start to think a little bit more, well, what about from David to the last of the kings, Jeconiah? And that's a problem too. want to take a little bit of a sidestep here and just mention that some of you may have noticed on a number of occasions, that I like to know about where people are from. And maybe that's not always the best thing to do, asking, well, where are you from? Because that's sometimes a problematic question. It's actually problematic for my own sons. But for me, it comes by way of a cultural imperative. I'm part of a group called Mennonites, an ethnic religious group called Mennonites. And we're always looking for connections with people around us. We used to work with another Canadian couple in Sierra Leone, and the woman's maiden name was the same as my surname, Wiebe. She wasn't related to me. But after some time, we made the discovery that Yvonne's grandmother and this lady's grandmother were cousins. For us, that's great among the Mennonite. Oh, now we know we're related. We're kin, we're clan. When I learn, for example, Kai, your parents, I thought I saw Kai here. Your parents aren't here today. But when I learned that they were from Poland, I was very quick to say, oh, my ancestors used to live in Poland. And if I find out that you're from Zimbabwe, what did I tell you? I have a daughter-in-law who is Zimbabwean. I'm looking for connections. If I discover that you're from Nigeria, okay, well, I don't have any of those kind of connections from Nigeria. So I'll say, oh, I really love ewedu soup. And I make ewedu myself. Okay? I buy the leaf from Yom Supermarket, and I make my own ewedu. And Eric, on my way in today, Eric, where are you? Oh, right at the back. Yeah. We were talking, and he mentioned that he knew that I'd just been in Sierra Leone, and I don't know how it came about, but we're talking about the weather, and then the fact that his parents are in Uganda. So what did we immediately start to talk about? The weather in Uganda, because I've been to Uganda quite a few times, and Uganda's the perfect weather. Forget about Lagos or Freetown or any of those places. You don't want to go there. You want to go to Uganda. So I'm always looking for a connection like that. And what Matthew was trying to do was to connect with his people and to demonstrate that he himself had a connection. So that's what Matthew was doing by using this very unorthodox list. Now, once you've got to Judah, you go now the people's thoughts are primed for what's happening. So now from Judah from King David, all the way through the kings. Who came after David? Come on, you got to know who was after David. Solomon, that's right. And after Solomon? Rehoboam, right? And so on through this list of kings. Well, now the people are thinking in a certain kind of way as they're going through this list, and they're thinking, well, yeah, those kings weren't so good either. Solomon, we already know what David did. Solomon started out pretty well, but he ended up marrying dozens and dozens and dozens of wives, and he ended up following them into their false religions. And Solomon didn't end up well. And so you go on through this list of kings, and you find that very few of them served God faithfully throughout their reign. Some spoiled an otherwise good reputation by tolerating or even encouraging Canaanite religious practice, or by making ill-advised alliances with other kings that then influenced them to corrupt their faith in the God of Israel. Some kings were evil people throughout their entire reign. And then you come to the last one, Jeconiah. And he was a young guy, but their country was already failing. Israel had already gone into captivity. The remaining part was called Judah. So this was the last of the kings of the line of Judah. And he was carried away into captivity. Never became, nothing good came of his kingship. Okay, and so that's the next branch in this. And Matthew's trying to say, do you guys get it? Yes, it's the holy line. But look what all has happened throughout this whole period. It's been one mess after another after another. So the dynasty of David eventually suffered decline and ended when the last king, Jeconiah, was carried away into exile. David's descendants had proved no better than his ancestors. So we come to the last 14 generations between Jeconiah and Mary's husband, Joseph. And what do we know about them? Nothing. Nothing. Now, the way that the Jews did things, there would be records in the temple. If we have this list up to now, 3,000 years later from, plus and minus from King David, right? If we have that list, we know that the Jews kept good lists of who belonged to who. They liked family business even more than the people in my background. I can go back as far as 6 cousins. They went a lot further back than that. And so anybody from Joseph on backwards, they could look in the temple and find out, oh yeah, it's true. He really is a descendant of Jeconiah. He really is in that line. Nobody could disprove Matthew because the records were still there. So that's what Matthew was trying to do. We've got a legitimate claim to Jesus. So why did Matthew do this? That was the first of the reasons for Matthew. I really believe that he was wanting to demonstrate that Jesus had a legitimate claim. You see, there was one last person in this list, and that was Mary. And in those days, this kind of word got out. They didn't need internet or anything like that. If this woman got pregnant and they weren't married yet, and somebody looks, no, they didn't have watches either, so they didn't look that. they didn't look, pull out their phone and look at the calendar. No, but they would count on their fingers and go, yeah, they're not even married yet, and look at her, right? And they would never be able to live that down as long as they lived. That was the future that Mary had to deal with. And if you think it was bad for Mary, think of what it was like for Joseph, because he knew that it wasn't him, but everybody would have thought that it was him. Right? And so that was a good reason to reject Jesus right there. How could he be a descendant of David? How could he be the Messiah when this is what he comes from? All right, so that's what Matthew is trying to do first, to demonstrate that doesn't matter. Get your head around it, because look at Judah, look at David, look at Boaz, look at, all of Salmon and etc. Look at all those ones. Look at Solomon. You think that's a problem? Well, then you've got bigger problems. So that was Matthew's first point. The second one, I believe, and it's sort of the reason that I chose this as the way that I would like to go to get today. And it's that it helps to explain how Matthew himself could be an apostle of the Messiah. Now, Matthew is also called Levi. That means that he came from a priestly family. He should have been a priest. But instead, he went into business. And he went into business with the Romans. He was a collaborator. He was a traitor to the Jewish people. He was making his wealth off the backs of a people that were subjugated by the Romans. And so Matthew, Levi, would have been a very hated man. He wouldn't have had Jewish friends. Period. So imagine when Jesus comes along and says, Levi, come, follow me. It says he left his tax tables right there because it was done in a public place. The kind of business that he had was done out in public. He just gets up from the table and follows Jesus. But everybody still knew who he was. Okay? He would have been a wealthy, well-known man in Jerusalem, and now he was following Jesus. And it's like, in Creole in Sierra Leone, we say, "Udak na you." Who do you, in other words, who do you think you are? Now Matthew knew that Jesus had called him. Matthew knew who Jesus was. Matthew was eternally grateful to Jesus for how he had changed his lives. So he's brought all of these up to say, you know what? I'm no better than any of the others. But if God could call the others into the line of his Messiah, he can call me too. Now Matthew starts his gospel with this genealogy, but he ends it by Jesus commissioning his disciples and saying to them, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age. Matthew believed that the biblical narrative of flawed and sinful people being called into a holy lineage means that none of us are unworthy either, or unworthy. Rather, you might say disqualified from being called into that lineage ourselves. There is a lineage that goes back from Jesus through many, many broken generations. But there's also a lineage that goes forward, and we're a part of that lineage. Each disciple of Jesus is part of that lineage that's going to be unbroken until the final fulfillment of his kingdom. So I want to ask, what about you? Do you see yourself anywhere in this story? I see myself in some people in this story. I like to think, I've done some bad things too. But if God could say of King David, a man after my own heart, maybe God can say that about me, that I can be a man after God's own heart. What about you? Who, if any, do you identify with in that lineage? And if you don't identify with any of them specifically, do you understand yourself to be, in a sense, one of them? I maybe didn't do this or that, but I did this. Okay? I've really spoiled what I could have been. I'm unworthy, or at least I'm disqualified. Of course you're unworthy. None of us are worthy. But we're not disqualified because Jesus came to die for us so that we could be part of his lineage. Okay? What about how you're used? You might feel like you're in that last group. The last group are the people that, one of the words that's used for them is cipher. They're a person that has no real identity. They're just, you're counting down through 14. These guys are ciphers. You got 14 names and you've never heard of any of them. And nobody's ever heard of any of them. Okay? That may be the way that you think of yourself. And you come to church every Sunday, you know that you belong to Jesus, but you sit there because you know yourself to be nobody. But God has something for you more than just being a nobody. You can be a disciple. If you've already really ruined things, you've got off to a really bad start. So did a lot of those ones. And God used them. And God wants to use you. So yes, all of us are unworthy, but none of us are disqualified.